About 10 years ago, back when I was in my mid-20s, I worked as a security guard at a cemetery tucked in the rougher part of the city. You wouldn't think a cemetery would need round-the-clock security, but trust me, it did. People would sneak in at night, spray paint graffiti on the headstones, and sometimes even try to dig up graves. I wasn't there for the worst of it, though. My shift ran from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., so I only had to be alone in the dark for a couple of hours each night. It wasn't ideal, but it was a hell of a lot better than pulling the graveyard shift. One evening, my boss came by and gave me a heads up about something strange. He said there had been reports of people hanging around the cemetery at odd hours, just loitering near the gates or watching from a distance. They weren't sure what the people wanted, but he told me to stay alert and keep an eye out. I brushed it off at first, figured it was probably some bored teenagers looking to cause trouble. In my experience, people rarely stayed long once they realized there was someone patrolling the grounds. But that night, something felt different. By 6 p.m., the other workers had cleared out, leaving me alone for the evening. This was always my favorite part of the shift, the quiet, the isolation. I didn't have to fake being busy or deal with anyone else. My job mostly involved riding around in a golf cart, checking for anything out of place. Between 6 and 8, I made a few rounds, picking up bits of trash, and watching as the last visitors left the grounds. Nothing unusual, just the typical end to a calm shift. Around 8:30, I went to lock up the front gate. As I wrapped the chain around the bars, I spotted a group of 3 people across the street, just standing there, watching me. Their faces were shadowed, but they didn't move. I figured it must be the group my boss warned me about, the ones who had been lurking around for the past few days. I watched them for a moment, but they just stood there, as still as statues. After a few minutes, they finally walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't think too much of it at the time. People loitered around here more than you'd think. An hour passed, and I found myself parked by the front gate again, sitting in the golf cart, the engine idling. That's when I heard it, a sharp, echoing sound that split the silence of the cemetery. It was so loud and distorted by the open space, I couldn't tell where it came from. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately drove toward the direction of the noise, scanning the area. As I crept forward through the field of headstones, I saw them, 2 figures standing still in the distance. My stomach churned. They didn't run when they saw me, they just turned to face me, like they had been waiting. The air felt heavy. I stopped the cart, trying to get a better look at them, but the shadow swallowed their features. Something about the way they stood there, motionless, staring, sent a shiver down my spine. Something was very wrong. I stopped the cart and stepped out, trying to steady my nerves. "The place closes at 8:30. You need to leave," I called out, walking toward the 2 figures. My voice was firm, but my heart was pounding. One of them shifted slightly, and that's when I noticed what they were holding: a shovel. A cold wave of fear shot through me as my eyes darted to the ground beside them. There was a patch of dirt that had clearly been disturbed, freshly dug, but it wasn't near any gravestones. They weren't here to visit anyone. Before I could say another word, a voice rang out from behind me. "Yo!" My blood ran cold. I whipped around just in time to see another man sprinting away in the opposite direction. Panic tightened my chest. I spun back to the 2 in front of me, but they were already bolting, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. Instinct kicked in. I rushed back to the cart, determined to chase them down, but as soon as I turned it on, the cart wobbled violently. Something was wrong. I jumped out to check, and my stomach dropped. Both left tires had been slashed, cut wide open. They'd sabotaged me. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and frantically dialed 911. The fear was overwhelming now. I could still feel their eyes on me, watching from the darkness. They had knives. What if they had more? I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I sprinted back to the main building, heart racing the entire time. Thankfully, they didn't follow, but the feeling of being hunted clung to me, and I couldn't shake it. When the police finally arrived, the group was long gone, swallowed by the night. But they hadn't left empty-handed, or rather, they had. As the officers searched the grounds, they found the patch of disturbed dirt where the men had been digging. And not far from that spot, caught on the cemetery fence, was something that made my skin crawl: a body bag. The officers confirmed it. Inside was a corpse, and after a few days of investigation, it turned out the body belonged to a gang member who had been killed in a recent shooting. The theory was that the group had been trying to dispose of the body, digging a makeshift grave in the cemetery, hoping no one would notice. If they'd managed to bury him, the body would have blended in with the countless other graves, hidden in plain sight. It wasn't the worst plan, I guess. But their execution was sloppy, and luckily they didn't finish it. The police searched for the men, but they were never found, never identified. To this day, I can't help but think how close I came to being another victim. If I hadn't spotted them, if I hadn't gotten out of the cart when I did, that night might have ended very differently. I still think about those figures standing in the distance, watching me, and how the night seemed to hold its breath just before everything went wrong. I had been working at a small cemetery on the edge of town for about a year, and while the job wasn't exactly scary, it was painfully boring. My shifts were always at night, which meant I was completely alone, sitting in a cramped little room, staring at 3 camera feeds, 2 covering the yard, and 1 on the entrance of the building. My boss gave me one simple instruction: if anything unusual happened, call the police. They'd handle it. Not that I ever needed to. Nothing unusual ever happened. It was a small cemetery in an even smaller town, a whole year on the job, and I'd never had to do more than lock up and keep an eye on the screens. Tuesday night was no different. I arrived just before sunset to relieve my coworker. I hadn't slept well that day, so I brought a large cup of coffee, hoping it would keep me awake through the night. After he left, I settled into my usual routine, sipping coffee, scrolling through my phone, glancing at the cameras every few minutes. It was quiet as usual, with nothing but the sound of the wind outside. By the time 1 a.m. rolled around, the tiredness hit me like a wall. I could barely keep my eyes open. The coffee wasn't doing much, and before I knew it, I was nodding off in my chair. I fought to stay awake for a bit, but eventually the weight of exhaustion pulled me under, and I dozed off completely. That was when everything changed. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of metal creaking behind me. My heart immediately raced as I spun around in my chair to see the door to the building slightly ajar, swaying ever so gently in the wind. The knot in my stomach tightened with fear. I was sure I had locked that door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I got up, pushing the door open wider to peek outside. The cold night air hit me, but there was no one in sight. No footsteps, no sounds, nothing. I quickly shut the door, this time locking it as firmly as I could, then sank back into my chair, trying to steady my breathing. My nerves were shot, but I told myself it had to be a fluke. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way earlier, but deep down I wasn't convinced. I rolled back the footage from the entrance camera, expecting to see someone approaching the door, but there was nothing. The door had opened on its own. As far as the footage was concerned, still shaken, I forced myself to stay awake, my eyes glued to the monitors, hyper-aware of every flicker on the screen. Then, after what felt like hours, movement caught my attention on the far end of the cemetery. I stared at the grainy image, a figure, slowly walking between the gravestones. At first I just watched, frozen, as they strolled aimlessly, their movements slow and deliberate. It didn't feel right. No one should be there at this time of night. My gut twisted with a sense of dread. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I explained to the operator that someone was trespassing in the cemetery. As I spoke, I kept my eyes locked on the figure. Then, out of nowhere, the figure broke into a sprint, dashing off camera in a blur. My heart skipped a beat, and I gasped out loud, eyes frantically scanning the other cameras to see where they'd gone. Seconds later, I spotted them again, sprinting past another camera, this time much closer to the building. My voice shook as I told the operator what was happening, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The figure was getting closer, moving fast. Then, on the camera that showed the outside of the building, he appeared. A man, standing still now, right outside the door. He didn't move. He didn't knock. He just stood there, facing the entrance. I could see him clearly on the screen, tall, his clothes dark and indistinct. Suddenly, he turned his head, looking directly into the camera, locking eyes with it like he knew I was watching him. My blood ran cold. "Hello?" His voice came from the other side of the door, muffled but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. Can you help me?" I froze. There was something deeply wrong with the way he spoke. It didn't sound like a real plea for help. It was off, like he was just repeating the words, testing how they felt on his tongue, like a child trying out a phrase they didn't quite understand. I stayed silent, too scared to move, my hand hovering over the phone. The man stood there for a moment longer, waiting for a response that never came. Then, without warning, he stepped out of the camera's view. My heart sank. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear him. His footsteps crunched softly in the grass, circling around the building. He was moving toward the back, where there were no cameras, no way for me to see where he was going, or what he was planning. I held my breath, listening as the sound of his footsteps grew closer, the soft crunch of grass turning into something more ominous. He was right behind the building, right against the wall behind me. I could almost feel his presence, hear him brushing against the siding. My body was rigid, my heart racing so hard I thought it might give me away. Then, as suddenly as it began, the footsteps stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My mind raced, imagining him waiting just beyond the wall, inches away from me. But before I could react, I heard the sound of his footsteps again. This time, they were retreating. Fast. He was moving away, fading into the distance as if he had lost interest. I sat there, my body trembling, waiting in tense silence until I finally heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. The relief I felt when the police arrived was overwhelming, but the fear lingered. They combed the area, finding clear shoe prints in the grass, leading far beyond the cemetery's border. The trail eventually vanished, disappearing into the trees. They couldn't find him. The officers told me that they believed me, that they had no reason to doubt what I'd seen, but I could tell by the look in their eyes that they didn't fully understand. How could they? I barely understood it myself. The man never came back. Since that night, nothing strange has happened at the cemetery, but even now, weeks later, the memory of his voice haunts me. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for something, watching. I still work there. The job's the same, the night's just as quiet. But one thing's different. I never fall asleep on the job anymore, not ever. My friends and I were never known for making the best decisions. We had a bad habit of doing dumb stunts, like sneaking into abandoned buildings or exploring vacant houses. Most of the time, nothing came of it, just some cheap thrills and laughs. But there was one night, one terrible decision that still keeps me up. It was the night we decided to go to the cemetery. It was a typical Friday night during sophomore year of high school. A couple of us were hanging out, not really doing anything, and by midnight, most of the group had already bailed. Two of our friends were too tired to keep going, which left just me and Jake. We were bored, but neither of us wanted to go home yet. That's when Jake had an idea. "Let's check out the cemetery by my place," he said. "It'll be spooky. It'll be fun." I didn't think much of it. It was just a graveyard. What could possibly happen? So I shrugged and agreed. We drove over to Jake's house, parked his car, and walked a few blocks to the cemetery. The place was surrounded by a short wooden fence, nothing that could stop anyone from getting in. There was an actual entrance, but we decided hopping the fence would be faster. As soon as we landed on the other side, I felt that rush of excitement, the kind you get when you're doing something you probably shouldn't be doing. But something about this place was different. It was dead quiet. Not even the usual night sounds of crickets or rustling leaves. And the lights scattered across the graveyard barely lit anything. It was just darkness, with the occasional silhouette of a gravestone standing out against the night. Looking back, I should have known something wasn't right from the moment we stepped foot inside. We didn't have a real plan that night. I guess the idea was just to walk through the cemetery, prove to ourselves we weren't scared, and call it a night. We strolled past rows of gravestones, trying to keep things light with small talk, though I could tell both of us were getting more tense with every step. We must have passed by 10 or 15 graves before Jake suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "What is it?" I whispered, but he didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on something ahead. Following his gaze, I squinted through the darkness and could just make out a figure standing near one of the graves, moving slowly in our direction. Both of us froze. The figure was getting closer, but we couldn't make out much detail. I thought it had to be a cemetery worker, someone who'd caught us trespassing. My mind raced through excuses, trying to figure out how we'd talk our way out of it. But something about the way he moved made my skin crawl. The figure stopped a few feet away, still too far for us to see his face clearly. His voice cut through the silence, low and gruff. "What are you two doing here?" Jake stammered. "We were just, exploring." The man didn't seem impressed. There was a long, uncomfortable pause before he spoke again. "Well, I'm gonna have to show you out." He motioned for us to follow and turned, walking back in the direction he came from. At that moment, I regretted not running the second we saw him, but we didn't want to make things worse. So we reluctantly followed a few steps behind him, hearts pounding. As we walked, something about him felt off. The further we went, the heavier the air seemed to get. When we passed under one of the cemetery's dim lamps, I finally got a better look at him. My heart sank. His clothes were ragged and filthy, definitely not what you'd expect a cemetery worker to be wearing. They hung loose on him, like he'd been wearing them for years. I caught a glimpse of his hands. His fingers were grimy, nails broken and dark with dirt. He didn't look like someone who worked here. He looked like someone who lived here. Jake must have noticed too, because we both slowed down at the same time. Something wasn't right. We were following the wrong kind of person, and I had no idea where he was leading us. Jake and I both stopped at the same time, every instinct screaming that we had made a huge mistake. The man must have sensed it too, because he stopped walking and slowly turned around. That's when we finally saw his face. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and filled with something far worse than anger. There was a madness there, like he'd completely lost touch with reality. His lips were cracked, twisted into an unsettling snarl. My stomach dropped as a wave of fear washed over me. "Come here," he snarled, his voice dripping with rage. That was all it took. Jake bolted without a second thought, and I was right behind him. I could hear the man's footsteps pounding the dirt just behind us, each one growing louder, closer. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Every nerve in my body was screaming that he was just inches away, about to grab me, pull me down, and I don't know how, but we reached the fence. Adrenaline kicked in as I scrambled over, my hands slipping on the wood, but I made it. As soon as my feet hit the ground on the other side, I heard the man stop. His footsteps ceased, replaced by a low, furious growl. Then came a loud bang as he punched the fence so hard I thought it would splinter. We didn't stop running until we were back at Jake's house, gasping for air and shaking with fear. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. We knew how close we had come to something terrible. We didn't tell anyone, except for a couple of our closest friends, mostly because we knew we could have gotten into serious trouble for trespassing. But the thing that still haunts me to this day is that man. He wasn't just some homeless guy. There was something more to him, something darker. Both Jake and I are convinced that he had something much worse in mind that night. Something far more sinister than just scaring us, or kicking us out. We never went back to that cemetery again. We never even talked about it after that night. But I still see his wild eyes sometimes when I close mine. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run when we did.